She walked in carrying a battered field notebook and a cup of gas station coffee, and not a single man in that compound gave her a second look. That was their first mistake. The morning had started the way most mornings did at Naval Special Warfare training facility, Coronado's auxiliary compound. Loud, aggressive, and bleeding. 3 handlers had already cycled through the run yard before 9 a.m., and all 3 had walked out the same way. Cradling their arms, their pride shredded worse than the protective sleeves the dog had torn clean through. The dog's name was Reckoning. That was the name stenciled on his kennel door anyway. The handlers called him other things. Things that didn't belong in polite company. Things that, if you listened closely enough, were less insults and more admissions of fear. Reckoning was a 4-year-old Belgian Malinois, 73 pounds of pure operational muscle. And for the last 11 weeks, he had been what the unit's commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Victor Ashford, officially described in his reports as non-compliant and operationally unsuitable. What Ashford said in private was considerably shorter and considerably less printable. The dog had belonged to one handler, a man named Specialist First Class Darnell Pruitt, who had raised Reckoning from a pup through the Naval Special Warfare K-9 development program, had deployed with him twice to the Horn of Africa, and had been killed by a sniper's bullet in a nameless village 14 months ago. After Pruitt died, Reckoning stopped working, not dramatically, not all at once. At first it was small things, hesitation on commands, a refusal to enter certain vehicles, a low growl when strangers reached for his harness. The veterinary reports called it adjustment disorder. The behavioral assessors called it handler grief response. The new handlers who cycled through just called it a problem. By month 4, Reckoning had bitten 2 people. By month 8, the bites required stitches. By month 11, Lieutenant Commander Ashford had filed the paperwork to have him euthanized. The paperwork was sitting on a desk, unsigned, the morning she arrived. Her name was Priya Senthil. She showed up at the compound gate at 0745 in a civilian vehicle, a dusty Subaru with a cracked bumper, and presented credentials that made the gate guard look twice and then look again. She wasn't military, she wasn't even government, technically. She was a contract behavioral specialist attached to a program so quietly funded that most of the men in that compound had never heard of it, and the ones who had heard of it weren't sure they believed it existed. The program trained dogs. But more specifically, it trained the bond between dogs and handlers. The difference, if you understood it, was everything. If you didn't understand it, you were probably Lieutenant Commander Ashford. Ashford met her in the briefing room with the energy of a man who had already decided the meeting was a waste of his time. He was 6'2", decorated 3 times for actions in theater and accustomed to people treating him accordingly. He looked at Priya Senthil, 29 years old, 5'4", in civilian clothes, with a battered notebook tucked under her arm, and did not adjust his posture even slightly. "Dr. Senthil," he said without offering his hand, "I was told you were coming. I was not told why exactly, given that the decision on Reckoning has already been made." "The decision hasn't been signed," she said. "It will be. By end of week. Then I have until end of week." She sat down without being invited to. "I'd like to observe him today. No intervention, no handling, just observation." Ashford looked at her the way men in his position often looked at people who didn't seem to understand how things worked. "You're welcome to observe from outside the run yard. I'd advise against getting any closer. The dog is unpredictable and frankly dangerous, and the last thing this unit needs is a liability incident involving a civilian contractor." Priya wrote something in her notebook. She didn't respond to the warning. "Is there anything else you need?" Ashford asked in a tone that suggested he hoped there wasn't. "Coffee would be great," she said. "Whatever you have is fine." She spent the first 2 hours sitting on a folding chair outside Reckoning's kennel. She didn't approach the fence. She didn't speak to the dog. She didn't make eye contact. She just sat, notebook open on her knee, pen moving occasionally, and watched. Inside the chain-link enclosure, Reckoning paced. He was a beautiful animal, even now, even wound tight as a spring, the classic Malinois build, lean and dense at the same time, with that characteristic fawn and black mask and ears like radar dishes that swiveled independently toward every sound. He paced the perimeter of the kennel in a pattern that had worn a shallow groove into the dirt. He paced it in the morning. He paced it when the handlers came. He paced it when they left. He had been pacing that groove for 11 months. One of the junior handlers, a young guy named Specialist Gareth Obi, leaned against the fence about 20 feet from Priya and watched her watching the dog. After a while, he couldn't help himself. "He won't calm down," Obi said. "He's been like this for months. The vets say it's neurological at this point. Stress response locked in a loop. They say it's not really fixable." Priya didn't look up from her notebook. "What do you say?" Obi blinked. Nobody had asked him that. I don't know. He was a great dog from what I heard. Before, he's still a great dog," she said. Obi looked at the pacing animal, the rigid muscles, the low constant energy that radiated off him like heat. "With respect, ma'am, that's not what it looks like." "No," she said. "It looks like grief. Those are different things." Obi didn't have an answer for that. He pushed off the fence and walked away. At 1100 hours, Lieutenant Commander Ashford came back to the run yard with two of his senior handlers, Chief Warrant Officer Brennan Loach and Staff Sergeant Terence Quill. They were not subtle men. They arrived the way men who are not subtle men usually arrive, at volume, with opinions. "Still at it?" Loach said, looking at Priya. He wasn't talking to her, he was talking to Quill. "Apparently," Quill said. Ashford crossed his arms and looked at Priya with something that wasn't quite respect and wasn't quite contempt. The particular expression reserved for people who were technically allowed to be somewhere, but whose presence was being tolerated rather than welcomed. "Has he shown any response to you?" "Not yet," she said. "That's expected. Expected." Loach repeated the word like it tasted funny. "The last contractor they sent out here, civilian behaviorist, 6 years with police K9 units, Reckoning took a chunk out of his forearm inside of 20 minutes. How long you been sitting there, Dr. Senthal? About 2 hours. And you're planning to, what? Sit there until he respects you?" "No," she said, writing something down. "I'm sitting here until he stops noticing me." Loach looked at Quill. Quill looked at Ashford. Ashford looked at the dog, which had paused its pacing briefly and was standing motionless, ears forward, watching the 3 men who had just arrived. Not watching Priya. He'd stopped tracking her about 40 minutes ago. "There's a readiness exercise at 1300, Ashford said. "We need the run yard. I'll be out of your way." The exercise involves Reckoning. She looked up from her notebook for the first time. "You're running him in a readiness exercise. We're assessing whether he can be run in a readiness exercise. It's a controlled environment. Handler wears full protective gear. Which handler?" The silence that followed was exactly 1 beat too long. "We rotate," Quill said finally. "Right," she said. She closed her notebook. "I'd like to observe." The readiness exercise at 1300 was, by any objective measure, a disaster. The scenario was simple. A new handler enters the run yard, establishes contact with the K9, and completes a standard obedience circuit. Sit down, stay, heal, recall. 3 minutes, beginning to end. Every working dog in the unit could do it in their sleep. The handler they sent in first was Quill himself, in a full bite suit that made him look like an astronaut who'd taken a wrong turn. He had worked K9 units for 9 years. He was not a small man or an unsure one. He lasted 90 seconds before Reckoning locked onto his left arm and refused every verbal command, every pressure technique, every override protocol in the manual. It took Loach and another handler with a catch pole 3 full minutes to separate them. Quill emerged from the run yard with his left sleeve destroyed and a bruise forming along his forearm the size and color of a plum. "He is not a training problem," Ashford said quietly, watching from the observation rail. He wasn't speaking to anyone in particular. "That dog is gone." "He's not gone," Priya said. She was standing 3 feet to Ashford's left, notebook pressed flat against her chest, and the words came out quiet enough that for a moment Ashford thought he'd misheard them. He hadn't. "Excuse me. He's not gone," she repeated. "He's waiting." Ashford turned to look at her fully for the first time since she'd arrived. The morning's tolerant condescension had cured into something harder. "Dr. Senthil, with respect, I have 11 months of behavioral assessments, 4 incident reports, 2 injury claims, and a veterinary recommendation that says otherwise." "He attacked every person who came in there using pressure dominance handling protocols," she said. "That's not a dog who's lost his training. That's a dog who's rejecting handlers who don't know him." Loach made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Ma'am, nobody here is going to claim they know that animal better than his original handler," she said. "I know. And that's the problem." Ashford's jaw tightened. "The original handler is dead. I know that, too." The run yard was quiet now, except for the sound of Reckoning pacing again, slow and deliberate, back and forth across the same worn track. From where they stood, he looked like a machine that hadn't been turned off properly, still running, but running without destination. "What exactly are you proposing?" Ashford asked. "Let me go in." The silence that landed on the observation rail was the specific variety that occurs when someone says something that is either very brave or very stupid, and no one present is sure yet which one it is. "Absolutely not," Ashford said. "I've worked with grief response K9s for 6 years. I've rehabbed 11 dogs that were flagged for euthanasia. 8 of them went back to active duty." "This isn't a rehabilitation timeline situation," Loach said. "We have a readiness window. If he can't operate in the next—" "I'm not asking for a timeline," she said. "I'm asking for 15 minutes. Ashford looked at her. He looked at Reckoning. He looked at the unsigned paperwork that was metaphorically sitting on his desk and would be literally sitting there until he walked back in that afternoon. "If that dog touches you," he said slowly, "this compound assumes no liability. You understand that? I have the waiver in my bag. I signed it this morning." Another silence, shorter this time. 15 minutes, Ashford said. "Loach and Obi on the catch poles outside the fence. The second I say pull, they pull." "Fair enough," she said. She reached into her field bag and took out a single item, a length of worn paracord in a specific shade of forest green, knotted at both ends in a pattern that meant nothing to anyone watching except, perhaps, to the dog she was about to approach. She didn't put on a bite suit. Loach started to say something about that, and she looked at him in a way that stopped the sentence before it started. Not aggressively, just with the calm certainty of someone who has made the calculation and is comfortable with the result. She approached the gate of the run yard the way she'd sat outside the kennel that morning, without urgency, without performance, without any of the dominant physical signaling that every handler before her had used as their opening move. She didn't square her shoulders. She didn't make herself bigger. She walked to the gate like she was crossing a parking lot. Reckoning saw her the moment the gate latch moved. He stopped pacing. The men on the observation rail above the run yard went still. Obi, gripping his catch-pole outside the fence, held his breath. Reckoning stood in the center of the run yard and tracked her with his eyes as she stepped through the gate. His ears were forward. His body was tight, coiled, but not launching. Not yet. He was reading her the way working dogs read everything, with a whole-body attention that most humans would pay significant money to learn. She stopped 12 feet inside the gate and turned sideways, not facing him. Not turning away, sideways, the body language of something that is not a threat and is not retreating. She looked at a point on the ground roughly between them and waited. 20 seconds. 30. On the rail, Ashford checked his watch. Loach gripped his radio. At 45 seconds, Reckoning took one step toward her. It wasn't a charge. It was a step. Careful. Weight shifted forward. Nose working. He took another. Stopped. His tail was low but not tucked. His ears had shifted back slightly from their locked forward position, which in Malinois body language is not submission, but the beginning of a question. She still hadn't looked at him directly. She reached into her left jacket pocket slowly enough that Obi outside the fence reflexively tightened his grip, and withdrew the length of paracord. She held it loosely in her left hand, down at her side, the knotted end hanging. Reckoning froze, and then something happened that made Specialist Gareth Obi, who had been working K9 units for 3 years, put his hand over his mouth. The dog put his nose to the paracord. He didn't lunge at it. He didn't investigate it with the cautious threat assessment sniff of a suspicious animal. He put his nose to it the way dogs put their noses to things that are already familiar, like recognition, like something returning from a very long way away. She still hadn't moved. Reckoning took the last 3 steps slowly, his whole body shifting as the locked-up tension began, degree by degree, to release. He pressed his nose into the paracord. He pressed his nose into her hand. And then Lieutenant Commander Ashford, standing on the observation rail with his arms crossed and his career's worth of controlled composure firmly in place, watched a dog that 3 certified behaviorists and 11 months of incident reports had declared unreachable lean his full weight against the leg of a woman who had been in his compound for less than 6 hours. Priya Senthil looked down at Reckoning. She said one word, quietly. Not a command. Something else. Something in the register between a name and a greeting. The kind of word that doesn't translate, because it was never meant to. Whatever it was in the same language as the knotted paracord and the turned sideways stance and the 6 years she'd spent learning to reach animals who'd been told they couldn't be reached. Reckoning lay down at her feet. The run yard was absolutely silent. Ashford came down from the observation rail slowly, the way men descend from places where they've been proven wrong, not in a hurry, working through it. He walked to the fence of the run yard and gripped the chain link and looked at what he was looking at for a long moment without speaking. Inside the yard, Priya was crouched at the dog's level. She wasn't doing anything dramatic. She was just there, her hand resting on Reckoning's shoulder, the paracord loose in her fingers. The dog's eyes were half closed. "What is that?" Ashford said, meaning the paracord. She looked up. It was Pruett's. The name landed in the air between them like a stone into still water. "How do you have Pruett's?" "His mother gave it to me," she said, "before I drove down here. She lives in Chula Vista, 20 minutes from this gate. I met with her last week." She paused. Nobody from this unit contacted her after the euthanization order was filed. She didn't know. I called her. Nobody on the fence said anything. "Pruitt used this cord for tug training from the time Reckoning was 9 weeks old," she said. "Same cord. Never replaced it. Dogs don't forget scent. They don't forget what safety smells like." Loach was looking at the ground. Quill, whose arm still ached from the morning, was looking at the dog. Obi was looking at Priya Senthil with an expression that, if you'd asked him to describe it, he wouldn't have been able to. Ashford said, "The euthanization order, I'd like you to rescind it. He hasn't been operational in 11 months. He's been in grief for 11 months. Those aren't the same thing." She stood up. Reckoning stood with her, pressed against her left leg. "He needs a new handler who goes through proper attachment training. Not pressure dominance protocol, attachment. It takes longer. It works." She looked at Ashford directly. "He's one of the best trained K9s I've seen in 6 years of doing this job. You don't throw that away because you're working the wrong method. He's been a liability. He's been mishandled." She didn't say it with heat. She said it the way you say something that's just true. Every person who went in that yard came in trying to establish dominance over an animal who'd already decided they weren't worth following. That's not the dog's failure. The silence stretched. Inside the yard, Reckoning sat down and looked at Ashford with the patient, direct attention of an animal who has been paying attention to this conversation and has his own opinions about how it should resolve. Ashford looked at the dog for a long time. "What kind of timeline are we talking?" he said finally. 90 days of attachment work with a matched handler. I supervise. Weekly assessments. And at the end of 90 days, "You'll have your dog back," she said. "The real one." It took Ashford until the following morning to rescind the order. He did it without fanfare, which was the only way Priya would have expected him to do it. He signed the rescission form, forwarded it to the veterinary unit and the program office, and sent her a 2-line email that said the paperwork was done and that she was authorized to begin whatever process she intended to begin. He did not apologize. She didn't expect him to. That wasn't the point. What she did expect, what she'd learned to watch for, in 6 years of doing this work in compounds not so different from this one, was the moment when the men who'd been loudest in their skepticism went quiet for a different reason. Not the quiet of dismissal, the quiet of recalibration. She saw it in Loach first, the morning after, when he came to the kennel area and stood watching her work through Reckoning's first structured session. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He stayed for 45 minutes. She saw it in Quill 2 days later, when he stopped by and asked, carefully, without making it sound like what it was, whether she thought the attachment protocol she was using could be adapted for general handler training. She told him it already had been, in 2 other facilities, and offered to send him the documentation. He said he'd look at it. She saw it in Obi almost immediately, because Obi was 23 and hadn't yet developed the habit of hiding what he was thinking. He started showing up early to watch and staying late to ask questions, and after the first week she began letting him assist. Small things at first, then more. He had good instincts, better than he knew. Reckoning progressed, not in the straight line that timelines and readiness windows demand, but in the organic, non-linear way that real recovery always moves. 2 steps forward, 1 back, a plateau, a breakthrough. By day 30, he was completing basic obedience circuits with the new matched handler, a quiet, methodical staff sergeant named Cole, who'd been selected specifically because he had, as Priya put it in her assessment notes, the patience of someone who understands that trust is not a command. By day 60, Reckoning was running controlled scenarios. By day 85, he did something that made Cole stop in the middle of a drill and look up at Priya with wide eyes. The dog had offered a behavior, a voluntary handler-directed alert, that wasn't in the drill. He'd smelled something off about one of the scenario props, broken protocol on his own judgment, and communicated it to Cole in a sequence so clean and precise that Cole had immediately recognized it and reported it up the chain. The prop turned out to be a training scenario that had been modified without informing the K9 team, a deliberate test that Ashford had quietly inserted to evaluate operational readiness. Reckoning had caught it, unprompted, independently. Ashford was in the observation room when it happened. He stood up slowly from his chair when the report came in, looked through the glass at the dog and the handler working together in the yard below, and said nothing for a long time. Priya was standing beside him. "Day 85, she said, not gloating, just noting. "Yes," said Ashford. 5 days ahead of the window. Yes. He was quiet for another moment. Below them, Cole was running a hand down Reckoning's back, and the dog was leaning into it. The same posture she'd first seen in the runyard, that full-weight lean that meant something specific and irreplaceable. "The methodology you used," Ashford said, "the attachment framework." "Yes? Is it documented?" "Formally, there's a published paper," she said. 2, actually. "And a training manual that 2 other commands have piloted. I can have it sent to your office." "Do that," he said. He didn't look at her when he said it. He kept looking at the dog and the handler below. But she'd been in enough rooms with enough men like him to recognize what was happening. The careful, methodical process of someone absorbing new information and reorganizing their understanding around it, which is harder than it sounds and rarer than it should be. She sent the documents that afternoon. The day Reckoning was officially reinstated to active operational status was a Thursday. There was no ceremony, There was paperwork, a veterinary clearance, and a unit readiness evaluation that he passed at the top of the assessment rubric. The evaluator noted in the formal report that Reckoning's performance was exceptional and that the K9 demonstrated advanced handler communication not typically observed in reintegration cases. Priya was packing her field bag in the small office they'd assigned her when Specialist Obi knocked on the door. "He wanted you to have this," Obi said. He held out a small object, a challenge coin, unit insignia on one side, a Belgian Malinois silhouette on the other. "Cole," he said. Obi stopped, collected himself. "He said to tell you that Reckoning picked him, not the other way around, and that you were the one who understood that first." She took the coin, turned it over in her palm once, set it on top of her notebook. "He's a good handler," she said. "He's learning to be great," Obi said. "He says that's the difference." He didn't know the difference before. She closed her field bag. "None of them did," she said. "It wasn't unkind, it was just the shape of how things had been, and how they were now, and the distance between the two." She drove out of the compound at 1400 hours in the same dusty Subaru she'd driven in with. The cracked bumper and the gas station coffee long gone, the battered notebook on the passenger seat full of new pages. At the gate, the guard who had looked twice at her credentials on the way in waved her through this time without checking anything. She called Pruitt's mother from the road. "He's going back to work," she said. On the other end of the line, there was a pause, and then a breath that carried more inside it than words usually manage. "Is he? Is he all right?" "He's more than all right," Priya said. He remembered everything. The highway opened up ahead of her, wide and flat and running south toward the water. Somewhere behind her, in a compound she would not see again for 90 days, when she came back to run the 6-month assessment, a dog named Reckoning was standing in the afternoon sun beside the handler who had learned to earn him, neither of them a weapon, and neither of them alone. That was how it was supposed to work. She had just needed them to see it.